Hi, friends, and welcome back to Module 10, where we're going to discuss crises of confrontation and malevolence. Now, you may have been looking forward to this module because these are a lot of the heightened crises that we see in the news media today. Crises of confrontation are oftentimes at a heightened level because it's an opposition. It's one against the other, often a person against an organization or a group of people against an organization. These are often marked visually by boycotts or pickets, sit-ins and blockades, and nobody loves drama more than the media because it's that picture of the little person versus the big person in terms of the boycotters versus the boycotted. Journalists love a good story of human interest, and the angles can be creative in how they actually address it. They're often all over the media. Now, dynamics of crises of confrontation to talk about. When we're thinking about how these crises begin to develop, there's several different stages, okay? We're talking about the opposition here. Oftentimes, that opposition is collecting information about an issue to which they are concerned or they're specifically very interested in. They choose the vulnerable targets. So speaking about the organization there, of policies or situations in which they feel they can exploit that organization or the government. They decide on the crisis-provoking tactics. So like I had said, is it a blockade? Is it a boycott? Is it a picket? Is it show up at a press conference and scream louder than anybody else to get attention? And then, of course, seeking the attention of the media so that they can get their message sent out. That is the beginning of how to identify whether crises of confrontation are beginning to formulate. The textbook does a real good job of actually laying out different crises of confrontation. One that's really close to my heart, I'll talk a couple about this week, is my full-time work is at another university in Boston University, and they have obviously suffered, like many organizations, crises of confrontation. But there was one where they were building, after 9/11, a lab to research infectious diseases, and there was crises of confrontation there because the local community in which it was built in Roxbury was concerned about the health and safety of the people in Roxbury where it was being built, near Boston Medical Center. So there was boycotts, there was eventual legal action. I'll continue to talk a little bit about this case as we go on, but I've seen these firsthand. I've read about them for the institutions I've worked on. That was certainly before my time at the university, but you can kind of still see, it's very interesting to see the effects of that. The Infectious Disease Center actually exists now, and you can actually go there and see it. Managing confrontation crises. So how are we actually going to manage it? Number one is assessing the power of the opposition. This has to continue to go on throughout the period of mitigation and preparation for potential crises of confrontation, rather. The primary sources for assessing this can often be newspapers, magazines, journal articles about who and where these people are. So the BU campus might have been able to assess the power of the Roxbury community by actually going out into the community, reading about who was there, who were the communal leaders, were there governmental activists, had they opposed infrastructure before to do risky research into diseases or other health crises. So there's a good situation there. Don't get caught by surprise. There's clearly now, even with social media, a real understanding of the movement of issues and trends amongst different audiences, and constant monitoring of that, as well as activist groups are really key in these sorts of crises. Assess your vulnerability. And when I say that, I don't just say that pejoratively, but I really think there's a couple tenets to this. Is the visibility and size of the vulnerability. Is it 3 people? Is it one crazy person? Is it a real serious activist organization? The type of market in which your company's products exist. Is it a particularly confrontational market that you're in, right? Is it one that people are heightened to be aware of, right? Is it the smoking industry? Is it the marijuana industry? These are markets where you might think, oh, okay, here specifically we could have crises of confrontation. Social performance of your organization. Again, this has to go with social media, but BU might have said, oh, do we actually even have effects on the community of Roxbury? Do they like us? Do they not like us? Do they see this as this elite university infiltrating their community? or do they see us as a partner in the urban greater Boston? So that's something to think about, and overall exposure. Um, Take initiative when dealing with the media, okay? I have experienced a crisis working in my full-time work. I work with a lot of students at Boston University, and we experienced a crisis at the center I work where a student wrote an op-ed in a newspaper about our center, which was very negative. Could be seen as like an online confrontation, and my superiors failed to take initiative in dealing with the media. Total failure on their part, and the story was controlled by somebody else. It eventually they took control, but that lag time really hurt the organization. So don't wait. Take initiative with the media. The opposition must not be allowed to monopolize the message or the storyline and the timeline. Enforce the law, but don't use it sparingly. What the Roxbury community did, I think, was a mistake in this case with BU, is they created legal action and they lost. They tried to go to Massachusetts Supreme Court and they lost. This takes issues to the next level. So what do you want to do instead of taking legal action? You could certainly say, if you don't move, or you don't move that blockade, we're going to sue you, right? We're going to call the police and remove you. That is not always the case. That is best. I can tell you, having worked with a lot of student opposition on campus, you certainly don't want the police showing up. That is just the worst case that can happen. Engage the opposition groups. Meet with groups that are reasonable. Now, they're not all reasonable, but meet with them. See if you can get middle ground with them. Be ready to accommodate and negotiate, right? Which means you're going to innately have to give something up. And as a crisis communicator, you might be the person facilitating that relationship and that meeting. How does it want to be seen? If police are showing up or there's legal action taking, you have essentially not only heightened the situation, but you have in some ways lost control of the image, which as crisis communicators and PR practitioners, friends, we do not want to do. You can consider involving public interest groups. So I specifically have dealt with a lot of crises related to the Middle East at the university where I work. And we're not, to even backtrack a little bit, we're always assessing the vulnerability of it, okay? Because there's a lot of potential crises of confrontation, of protests and activists confronting you about your involvement in different countries in the Middle East, and why not, and you have students from different backgrounds. So we're constantly vulnerable, and we're assessing the social performance and the social media of the activists that we know about in the activist group. But we often involve public interest groups to kind of moderate. So that's another thing to consider. The reality is that crises of confrontation, friends, are going to happen in the society that we're in today, right? We live in a democratic, free society where people are going to be able to speak their voices and want to speak their voices. We've seen it at presidential press conferences. We see it all over in every sort of market and industry that we're in. The key is to not be caught offhand. These issues are complex and often difficult to explain. The opposition is usually extremely strong and perceived by the audience of the media to be weak. Whether that's true or not doesn't matter, but that's how the perception is. Remember, you are experts in perception management. And the opposition needs exposure, right? So remember that. They are a minority trying to have a majority voice, right? They're trying to scream loudly. And this is even more heightened in the case of having social media now, where one or two people can have a really loud voice. So assess the public opinion, assess whether people are being persuaded or not. Is there political action? Is there legal action needed, et cetera, et cetera. So there's several good crises to read about this week. I've also recorded a bit of time about crises of malevolence, which we're also discussing this week. And the discussion this week leaves a little bit open for you to choose what to discuss. So I think this is a very interesting set of topics, crises of confrontation and malevolence, and I hope you enjoy this week's material. Thanks, everyone.